Fine. Firstly, perhaps you could just say who you are and your formal spokesman position for the Labour Party.
Okay, my name is Cwr Bk MP, and I'm the Shadow Minister for Older People, Social Care and Carers.
It's obviously very early days with the comprehensive spending review. Appreciate you the time to analyse it. What's your overall first impression?
Well, I think it's very disappointing that with all of the lobbying that there's been of the Chancellor and government ministers about social care and the issues in social care and the care sector, that so little attention went into that. And in fact, there's just one suggestion about councils being able to raise a tax. So, in fact, what I've said to the Chancellor this afternoon is you just push the problem, a big problem of social care funding and underfunding, you've pushed that out to councils, and that's what I think he has done.
Do you think, certainly some of the commentators have sort of said that it's a little bit about delegation, that you give it to someone else to do, so if it goes wrong you can blame them?
Well, that's clearly that. I think these days we all believe that better decisions are often made closer to the point where services are being delivered, and so that there's a reason for that. But to take something where there's already £4.6 billion of cuts and where there's a gap that is opening up by £700 million every single year over the next few years, and say, well, over to you, that does really look like that, doesn't it? It really looks like that. And to say that councils can raise tax to pay for it, I mean, people are struggling, say, in my constituency, my local authority area, will welcome the prospect that they not only are not getting the social care services they should get, but now families are going to have to pay, 30, 40, £50 more for the privilege every year, just out of their council tax. So that's not a good thing.
And one financial analyst we've spoken to said there was a lot about youth, a lot about business, getting people into work, investment in areas, and all items he was telling Carers World Radio that are in themselves good things. But he said, apart from reference to the state pension, there wasn't really much for the elderly in that. So is it the case, do you think, that on his first impression is that basically you work all your life in order to pay for your retirement?
Yes, but I think the difficulty is, there are some issues even for older people that since I've been in this new role, we've been talking about a lot of those. But it's not the same in different parts of the country. So this idea of raising more for social care from different councils being able to raise 2% of council tax, 2% of council tax base in areas where there are a lot of expensive properties is a very different amount of money from 2% where the cost of properties is very low. And it's not fair. There's a fourfold difference between the least that can be raised and the most that can be raised. But really funding ought to be allocated on the basis of need. So the places with more older people, so the places with more to fund, if you like, that's the basis on which it should be done. And it shouldn't be, effectively we're saying it can only be raised based on the values of property. Well, that's just a complete lottery, isn't it? If you happen to live in an area where it brings in a lot of money from council tax, so that's just unfair. And
not only have you got the local variations, you've also got, generally, it seems to be accepted now, that we have a population with a longer life expectancy. Indeed, the Chancellor referred to that in his statement today.
And that's different in different places because, of course, sometimes in parts of London, in other cities, older people don't tend to stay or to move there. But certain seaside towns, people do move to, don't they? So it's very spread, and the needs are very spread. So really, it's not a sensible way of going forward, and it's very, very disappointing in terms of the amount of money just isn't enough.
One of the things that also seemed to underpin the statement was reference to online to digital, particularly in the context of the tax offices closing that proposal. But certainly some of our listeners have said, do you know what? There's people around who you walk along the street and their heads are in their phones and they're not looking where they're going. So a number of our listeners at Carers World Radio have raised the issue, really, does social media online mean that there's more personal isolation rather than more community togetherness?
It can be, can't it? Certainly if people have always got their heads down and notoriously young people are always playing games on their iPads or their Xboxes and so on. But it genuinely needs to be that we recognise what the different needs are in different areas and meet those needs, I think. And I think just a general saying everything's going to move online ignores the fact that, you know, what do you do if you're not online? And that's what's really wrong with that. You know, clearly that's the trend over time, but you can't leave people behind. And I think maybe that's what your listeners think too. Why should they get left behind just because they're not using a particular technology? And there's all the points some people can't afford it. You know, I mean, broadband and the cost of buying phones and iPads and so on. I mean, that is genuinely an issue for parents with children at school these days, that, you know, there seems to be you have to have a laptop or an iPad to do your homework, and I know lots of parents are worried about that. And so there's lots of different groups haven't got that technology and they shouldn't be left out of it, and they may not want it, and that's fair enough too.
So in overall terms, obviously, as I say, it's very much an initial impression. What would your message be to carers? I mean, should they be worried? Should they be feeling positive? Or perhaps they just feel perhaps uncertain? And I mean, how do you feel maybe the next few days and weeks will pan out? Will more information emerge? Will the impact be easier to assess?
It's usually it takes a few days to unravel a budget or an autumn statement like this, because there's a book giving all the details and it's quite hard to work out. It's not good news that local councils have had their funding cut. That's not good news. It's not good news that social care hasn't had its funding gap addressed, so that those are not good. Some things will help. Some carers were going to be hit by the tax credit cuts, and I have raised that a number of times here, and I'm pleased for all the people who won't have the tax credit cuts. You know, we should all be pleased, I think, that the police are not going to be cut in the current, you know, security situation. That's a good thing. So it's some things on either side really, but I mean overall for carers, what's really important to them are mostly local services for their local area. It's good that health has got its funding, but it's not good that social care hasn't got its funding, because really, you know, we believe in my team that a cut to social care is a cut to the NHS. If you don't get that part of it right, the two are increasingly interlinked, and in fact the Chancellor talked to me about integration, but it's no point in giving money to one side of the equation and not to the other.
And he said, I think it was that in his view, it was unprecedented. This budget represented, or this statement represented, unprecedented support for social care. He announced money for mental health provisions, and generally there was an overall positive feeling about how he delivered the statement.
Well, I think there's no Chancellor wouldn't present what he's presenting without a positive air. They always feel very good about the work that they've done, but when I asked him a very direct question about social care and how was he going to plug that gap, that very substantial and growing gap, he didn't have an answer. He shuffled his papers and you know, just waffled on about integration. So, you know, there isn't an answer there. If it really was unprecedented, he'd be closing the gap of funding and putting enough money in this year and next year and every year for our growing population with needs with social care. We should be glad and rejoicing that we're all living longer. That is a cause for celebration, but not if we don't have the services we need. We don't want people to be isolated. We don't want carers to have more of a burden of care. And it's very important, you know, that is met. I mean, I would say to carers, you know, I appreciate the work you do. I think you do a brilliant job. The government doesn't always recognise that. I think that sometimes what carers do is just taken for granted. And I want to work to build a better future for carers. I've been 10 years in Parliament and I've worked on that since I've been here, and I want to make sure that their needs are heard, that they are listened to, and I promise that I'll just keep trying to do that.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.